David Crawford strolled leisurely along the marina, soaking in the late afternoon sun as it reflected off the shimmering water. His custom Italian leather shoes clicked against the wooden planks with each confident step. This was his world, a realm of luxury and excess, where million-dollar yachts lined up like proud soldiers waiting for their next adventure. The harbor was a testament to his hard work and the success he had earned over the years. Every weekend, he indulged in the same ritual, inspecting his prized yacht, the Legacy, before taking it out for a spin. Today seemed like any other day, or so he thought. As David neared his yacht, something unusual caught his eye. Sitting alone at the far edge of the dock was a man who seemed completely out of place in this playground of the rich. His clothes were tattered and dirt-streaked, his hair an unkempt mess that hinted at months, if not years, of neglect. The man sat hunched over, his shoulders sagging, as though carrying an invisible weight. In front of him lay a small cardboard sign with barely legible writing, "Lost everything. Just need a chance." David paused, momentarily taken aback. He had seen homeless people before, of course, but not here, not in this exclusive part of town. He took a step closer, curiosity tugging at him. There was something about this man, a strange familiarity that David couldn't quite place. He could have easily ignored him, moved on, and continued with his day. After all, what could they possibly have in common? But something in the man's eyes, piercing yet filled with a quiet sadness, compelled David to approach. "Hey," David said, trying to mask his unease with a friendly tone. "What are you doing here?" The man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied David. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly masked by a wary smile. "Just trying to get by," he replied hoarsely, "looking for a little kindness in a world that doesn't have much of it." David felt a twinge of discomfort at the man's words. Here he was, a man who had never known what it meant to want for anything, facing someone who had clearly lost everything. "What's your name?" David asked, genuinely curious now. "Tom," the man replied simply. "Tom Reynolds." "Well, Tom," David said, his tone shifting into one of forced casualness, "how about you join me on my yacht for a bit? You look like you could use a meal and some rest." Tom's eyes widened in surprise. He glanced at the yacht behind David, then back at him, as if trying to decipher whether this was some sort of cruel joke. "Why would you invite me?" he asked cautiously. "You don't even know me." David shrugged, trying to play it off. "Maybe I just need someone to talk to, or maybe I'm just curious. Either way, the invitation stands." For a moment, David thought Tom would refuse, but after a long pause, the man nodded. "All right," Tom said quietly. "I'll take you up on that." The two walked towards the Legacy, the contrast between them striking. David, with his designer clothes and air of confidence, and Tom, with his worn-out attire and the heaviness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. As they stepped aboard, David motioned for Tom to sit, offering him a bottle of water and some food. For the first time in what seemed like ages, Tom allowed himself to relax, leaning back into the plush seating and taking in the opulence that surrounded him. He couldn't help but let out a soft, ironic chuckle. "You live in a different world," he muttered, more to himself than to David. David didn't respond right away. He was too busy observing the man in front of him, trying to understand what had led him to this point. "So, tell me your story," David finally asked, genuinely interested. "How did you end up here?" Tom took a long sip of water, then began to speak, his voice low and gravelly. "I wasn't always like this, you know," he said, gesturing to his ragged clothes. "I had a business once, a family, a house, the whole package. But then one bad decision led to another, and I lost everything. Business partners turned their backs, deals went south, and before I knew it, I was on the streets." His voice trembled slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "You wouldn't believe how quickly it can all be taken away." David listened intently, feeling an unexpected pang of empathy. There was something hauntingly familiar about Tom's story, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." Tom looked at him with a wry smile. "No, you can't," he said, not unkindly. "But that's okay. I don't expect you to. It's not something you can understand unless you've lived it." The yacht began to drift further from the shore, and as the city skyline receded, the conversation turned deeper. They spoke about life, success, and failure, with Tom's words holding a wisdom that struck David to his core. For a moment, David forgot about the world of wealth he belonged to, lost in the stories of a man who had once walked in similar shoes, but had stumbled, fallen, and been left behind. An hour passed, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the water, Tom's expression suddenly changed. He became quiet, contemplative, before finally reaching into the pocket of his tattered jacket. With trembling hands, he pulled out a small, faded photograph and handed it to David. "This was taken a long time ago," Tom said softly. David took the photo and stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was an image of a younger Tom, dressed in a sharp suit, standing next to a man David knew all too well, his own father. David's mind reeled as he struggled to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be possible. He felt a wave of confusion, followed quickly by disbelief, and then an uncomfortable tightening in his chest, as if the world around him had suddenly shifted into unfamiliar territory. He looked up at Tom, who was watching him intently, waiting for some sort of recognition. How do you know my father?" David stammered, his voice betraying his shock. He felt like a child caught in a lie, his carefully constructed world suddenly collapsing around him. Tom took a deep breath, the years of pain and regret etched into the lines on his face becoming even more pronounced. "I wasn't just some acquaintance, David," he said slowly, his tone heavy with emotion. "I was his business partner. We built our company from nothing, back when no one believed in us. We worked day and night, pouring our blood, sweat, and dreams into something we believed in." David felt a sudden chill run down his spine. His father had always been a hero to him, the man who had built a business empire from the ground up, who had taught David everything he knew about hard work and ambition. But never once had his father mentioned a partner, let alone someone who had been so integral to the business's early success. Why have I never heard about you?" David asked, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Tom chuckled, but there was no humor in it, only a deep sadness. "Because your father made sure of that," he said, his voice tight with the memory. "When the company started taking off, we made a deal with a group of investors. It was supposed to be our big break, the moment when all our dreams would finally become reality. But as the money started rolling in, your father, he changed." Tom paused, as if reliving the betrayal was almost too painful to put into words. "He pushed me out. He used legal tricks, backroom deals, and eventually I was left with nothing. My shares were worthless, my name erased from the company records. It was as if I never existed." David felt a sickening knot form in his stomach. "No, that's not possible," he whispered, more to himself than to Tom. "My father wouldn't do something like that." Tom shook his head sadly. "I know you want to believe that, David. I wanted to believe it too, for the longest time. I thought maybe there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding, but there wasn't. He took everything from me, and when I tried to fight back, I was destroyed." Tom's eyes grew distant, staring out at the horizon as if he were seeing ghosts. "I lost my family, my home, my dignity, everything. I had to leave, disappear, because I couldn't bear to face the people who believed in me, who had put their trust in me. I became nothing." David's hands were trembling now, the photograph still clutched between his fingers. It felt like a lifeline to a past he knew nothing about. "Why are you telling me this?" he demanded, anger and confusion bubbling to the surface. "Why now, after all these years?" Tom's gaze met his, and in that moment David saw something that shook him to his core, a mixture of pain, forgiveness, and a glimmer of hope. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Tom said softly. "You're not your father, David. You have a chance to be better, to right the wrongs that were done. But you need to understand where you come from. You need to know the cost of the life you've been living." David felt the air leave his lungs, as if he had taken a punch to the gut. His entire life, he had prided himself on being a self-made man, on building his empire from scratch. But now that image was shattered, replaced by a truth that was far uglier, far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You don't have to say anything right now," Tom replied, his tone gentle but firm. "But you do need to decide what kind of man you want to be. You can ignore this, pretend it never happened, and go on living your life in blissful ignorance. Or you can choose to confront it, to face the truth, and to use the power you have to make things right." David stared at him, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. He felt like he was standing at a precipice, staring into an abyss that threatened to swallow him whole. Part of him wanted to turn away, to forget everything Tom had told him, and return to his life of luxury and comfort. But another part, a part he hadn't realized existed until this moment, felt an undeniable pull towards the truth, however painful it might be. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" David finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why wait until now?" Tom sighed, running a hand through his tangled hair. "Because I wasn't ready," he admitted. "For years I was angry, bitter. I wanted revenge, to make your father suffer the way I had. But as time went on, I realized that wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I just wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. And when I saw you today, walking with that same confident stride your father used to have, I knew it was time." David felt his eyes sting with unshed tears, a wave of emotions crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had always believed in the fairness of the world, in the idea that hard work and determination would lead to success. But now, he was faced with the harsh reality that his success had been built on the ruins of another man's dreams. "I don't know if I can fix this," he said quietly, his voice cracking with uncertainty. Tom smiled, a flicker of warmth returning to his eyes. "You can't change the past, David. None of us can. But you can choose what kind of future you want to create. That's something your father never understood." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. David knew that the choice was his to make. He could walk away and continue living in the shadow of his father's legacy, or he could step into the light and build something new, something that was truly his. As they sat there in silence, the yacht drifting lazily on the waves, David felt something inside him shift. For the first time in his life, he understood that being rich wasn't about the money, the yachts, or the power. It was about the impact you left behind, the lives you touched, and the legacy you chose to build. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, David made a vow to himself. He would be different, he would be better, and he would find a way to make things right no matter how long it took. David sat on the yacht, still clutching the faded photograph, as the reality of Tom's story began to sink in. The waves lapped gently against the hull, but all he could hear was the thundering of his own heartbeat. He felt a rush of conflicting emotions: disbelief, anger, shame, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. It was as if the very foundation of his life had cracked open, revealing secrets that had been buried for years. He thought about his father, the man who had taught him about business, who had been his role model, his hero. How could he reconcile the image of the loving father he had known with the ruthless, cold-hearted businessman who had betrayed a friend and partner? "Why didn't you fight back?" David finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He couldn't understand how Tom, a man who seemed so capable and intelligent, had allowed himself to be erased so completely from the life he had helped build. Tom sighed deeply, a weariness in his eyes that spoke of years spent battling his demons. "I tried," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "At first I tried to fight. I hired lawyers, took the case to court, but your father was always one step ahead. He had resources I didn't, connections I could never hope to match. Every door I knocked on was slammed shut. Every appeal I made was denied. Eventually, I ran out of money. I had to sell my house just to pay the legal fees. And then, there was nothing left. No one wanted to take on a lost cause." David clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger toward the man he had idolized. "I don't understand. Why would he do this? What did he gain by destroying you?" Tom gave a sad, knowing smile. "Power," he replied simply. "Your father wanted total control. He couldn't stand the idea of sharing his success with anyone. He wanted to be the sole architect of his empire, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen, even if it meant betraying the people who helped him get there." David shook his head, struggling to comprehend this new version of his father. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to Tom. "I thought he was a good man." "Maybe he was once," Tom said gently. "But success changes people. It warps them, makes them forget where they came from and who they used to be. Your father wasn't always like that. When we first started out, he was kind, generous. We were like brothers." Tom's voice broke slightly, and he had to take a moment to collect himself before continuing. But as the money started rolling in, something shifted. He became obsessed with winning, with being the best no matter the cost. David felt an ache in his chest, a sense of loss that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. It was as if he were mourning a man he never truly knew. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why tell me all of this now?" Tom stared at him for a long moment, and then, to David's surprise, he reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I want you to be better," Tom said quietly. "I want you to take the legacy your father left behind and turn it into something good. Something that will help people instead of destroying them. You have the power to do that, David. You have the chance to make things right." David felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded, unable to speak. He knew that Tom was right. He had been given an opportunity to change, to rewrite the story that had been handed down to him, and he was determined not to waste it. Over the following weeks, David threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. He spent hours poring over old documents, trying to piece together the truth about his father's business dealings, unraveling the web of lies and deceit that had been carefully woven over the years. It was a painful process, each new discovery cutting deeper than the last, but David refused to turn away. He knew that if he was going to make things right, he had to confront the reality of his family's past, no matter how ugly it might be. He began reaching out to people who had been hurt by his father's actions, offering them compensation, apologies, and, in some cases, new opportunities. He met with former employees who had been wrongfully terminated, with partners who had been pushed aside, and with investors who had been swindled. It was exhausting work, and there were days when David felt like giving up, when the weight of his father's sins threatened to crush him. But every time he felt himself faltering, he thought about Tom and the chance he had been given to make a difference. One evening, several months after their initial meeting, David invited Tom to dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor. It was a small, intimate space, a far cry from the flashy establishments that David usually frequented, but it felt right somehow. As they sat down, Tom looked around, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You've changed," he observed. "The old David would have taken me to a 5-star place with crystal chandeliers and a $100 wine list." David chuckled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "The old David didn't know what mattered," he replied. "I'm trying to be different." Tom nodded, his expression softening. "I can see that," he said, "and I'm proud of you. You've done more in these past few months than most people do in a lifetime." "It's not enough," David said quietly, his gaze dropping to the table. "It'll never be enough." "That's not the point," Tom said gently. "You can't change the past, David, but you can build a future that's worth living for. That's what matters." For the first time in a long while, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. He realized that he had spent so much of his life chasing after material wealth, success, and recognition that he had lost sight of what truly mattered: kindness, integrity, and the willingness to lift others up. And in that moment, he knew that he had found something far more valuable than all the money in the world. As the months turned into years, David and Tom's partnership grew into something extraordinary. Together, they established a foundation dedicated to helping people who had fallen on hard times. They provided housing for the homeless, job training for the unemployed, and financial support for struggling families. The foundation became a beacon of hope for countless individuals, a symbol of what could be achieved when compassion and determination were allowed to flourish. David's transformation did not go unnoticed by the world. The media picked up on his story, and soon articles and documentaries were being made about his journey from privileged millionaire to compassionate philanthropist. But David didn't care about the attention or the accolades. For him, the real reward was seeing the lives he had helped to change, the smiles on the faces of people who had found hope in the midst of despair. One day, as David and Tom stood on the deck of the Legacy, looking out at the endless expanse of ocean, Tom turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You've done well, David," he said quietly. "Better than I could have ever imagined." David smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "I had a good teacher," he replied. Tom shook his head, chuckling softly. "No, you found your own way. I just pointed you in the right direction." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and gold. And as the first stars began to appear, David felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. He knew that he would never be able to undo the damage his father had caused, but he could spend the rest of his life trying to make things right. And that, he realized, was the true meaning of wealth. Not the money, not the yachts, not the power, but the ability to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than you found it. And as the waves lapped gently against the yacht, carrying them toward a future filled with endless possibilities, David knew that he had finally found his true legacy.